Hi, my name is David Dodge, and I've had the enormous privilege of traveling this country for the last decade or so, talking to people about energy transition and about a move to a whole bunch of different solutions that'll help us tackle climate change. And so what I'm here to do today is to talk to you about 5 steps to a sustainable future. I'm trying to digest all that down to 5 things. If we do these 5 things, we can not only survive climate change, we might be better off in the long run. So hopefully you'll agree at the end of this. The first thing we need if we're going to survive climate change is clean energy. A lot of our emissions come from energy, and we need to clean it up. So the happy news is that investors have already moved in that direction, and of $13.3 trillion that are planned for investment in new electricity generation between now and 2050, they're projecting 77% of that will go to renewable energy, mostly solar and wind around the world, which is really interesting. And here in Alberta, what we learned last year was we don't have to do this just to do the right thing. We can do this because wind and solar are now the cheapest forms of electricity money can buy. That is new news, and that really makes our response to climate change a heck of a lot easier. The next thing we need, if we're going to survive the climate crisis, is zero emissions transportation. Transportation is, anywhere from 1/3 to about 40% of the emissions in the world today. And I look to Elon Musk for inspiration. Now, he inspired us to think seriously about electric vehicles. I give him full credit for that. And it's because he's produced a car that's not only zero emissions, it's actually a better car. It's faster, it has longer range, and it has zero emissions. And so what has happened with that is really cool. The whole car industry, we've now gone over the hill and we're on a toboggan sliding down the other side. And I couldn't have said this very long ago in history, because until very recently, electric cars were basically a novelty and occupied a very tiny niche part of the market. But now, every single car maker in the world has invested about $300 billion in new electric vehicles. Basically, the whole industry is investing everything they have in developing electric vehicles. And what does that look like on the ground? We could see as many as 700 new electric vehicles by 2025. Almost all the car makers have 2025 deadlines, not 2030 deadlines, and we could see a lot of choice, a lot better price, and we already know it's cheaper to drive an electric car over on a life cycle basis of owning a car. So the future is electric, and we can do that. What does it look like on the ground for cities? Like, why are we doing this? One of the reasons is cities are addressing climate change more than any other level of government. And for example, if you look at Copenhagen right now, they've already set a goal in their city to ban diesel vehicles from their city as of 2025, and they're going to ban gasoline or internal combustion engines as of 2030. So this really does demand either clean fuels, hydrogen, or electric vehicles. And the car industry appears to be betting on electric vehicles. What about the homes we live in? What about the buildings we need to work in? Well, we now know, and thanks to a lot of work we've done here in Alberta, that we can actually produce buildings that are also zero emissions, which have a whole bunch of other great benefits as well. In fact, the most affordable net zero home in all of Canada was built right here in Edmonton, Alberta. We know we can produce these very efficiently, very effectively, and we know the cost of ownership is actually lower over the long term, and that they'll produce zero emissions. So a net zero home, very simply, is a home powered by solar and heated by a heat pump. So there's no gas connection, there's no emissions associated with the home, and you actually get rid of a utility bill, which is actually great in the long run for homeowners. We know we can scale this up. In Vancouver, they're building passive house apartment buildings like the one you see. This apartment building is so efficient, you can heat 6 suites in the apartment building on the worst winter day of the year using a hairdryer of 1,800 watts. So you could heat 6 suites in a building with a hairdryer, which is how efficient these buildings are. And that's where we need to get to tackle climate change. We know that you can build department stores now, thanks to Simons, that are fully net zero, powered by solar and heated by geothermal. We know you can build car dealerships that are net zero and passive house quality. In fact, one was done right at Scott Subaru right here in Alberta in Red Deer. One of my favorite stories that kind of explains why these new ideas are actually a good idea and not just an unnecessary expense is there's a church in Edmonton, Westmount Presbyterian Church, that actually built with the Right at Home Housing Society, the first net zero church and social housing project in all of Canada. So why is that so cool? Well, in the past, if they would have done this, they would have built 16 units for their social housing and had a gas bill for every single one of them. Now they have no gas bill, and they have one geothermal system that heats all 16 units and the church itself, which actually is a really serious act of sustainability, both for the church and for the sustainable housing organization, because it helps them reduce their operating costs for the long term. How do we take all these ideas, sustainable transportation, sustainable homes, and sustainable energy, and how do we package them in a city? Can we build the whole city like that? Well, about almost 1,500 cities around the world have declared a climate emergency, and many dozens and dozens have really serious climate plans, such as Copenhagen. Copenhagen wants to be the first net zero city. That means all energy, whether it's gasoline for cars or natural gas for heating or in their electricity system by 2025. Not 2050, 2025. Oslo, Norway is the first city in the world to develop a carbon budget. So they're keeping track of how much carbon they're producing by putting it in a balance sheet as they're developing projects and making sure that they have a very, very low carbon footprint. We also know that 28 cities and about 6 states around the world have now committed to make their existing buildings net zero by 2030. And those same cities have also pledged, and states, to have their entire communities net zero by 2050. In Edmonton, we're part of this. Believe it or not, we have the highest emissions rates in the world among cities. We have about 20 tons per capita, but Edmonton is doing some incredibly visionary things. It has an energy transition plan that totally rises to the task. It has the largest carbon neutral community in the world in Blatchford, which will be heated by geothermal and will use a lot of solar energy. And it has a goal of getting 100% renewable energy to run the city. The last element we need, I think, if we're going to make the world sustainable, coming out of these crises and dealing with the climate crises, is empowered citizens that actually believe we can do this and make a difference. It's interesting, the largest protest in Canadian history was not about Quebec separation. It wasn't for or against pipelines in Alberta. It was for action on climate change. 500,000 people gathered in Montreal, Quebec, last year, when this young lady, who was 16 years old at the time, came to Montreal, and her name, of course, is Greta Thunberg, and she started protesting climate change by herself as a 15-year-old, sitting by herself outside of the Swedish Parliament buildings in Sweden. And of course, that's grown to be one of the biggest mass movements, probably in human history, in terms of tackling perhaps one of the most difficult issues. We know here in Edmonton that we care about climate change. The city's done research and found that 74% of us want to see action on climate change. And in fact, one of the largest protests in my memory here in Edmonton was about climate change. It was when that same young lady, Greta Thunberg, was here. We had 10 to 12,000 people at the legislature grounds here in Edmonton. There were so many people, it even spilled out behind the legislature and into the downtown area of downtown. So I think, when we're talking about these 5 things, 5 steps to sustainability and a future where we're actually tackling climate change and building an economy where we'll actually have work and where our cities will thrive, I think, to use the Wayne Gretzky analogy, we need to skate where the puck is going to be. And, I see in that, if we do that, I see a future with benefits. And those benefits will come from the trillions of dollars being invested in clean energy that is actually cheaper. It'll come from the billions of dollars being invested in clean transportation already, and that will be cheaper. It'll come from trillions being invested in efficient buildings, and our buildings will be cheaper, certainly in a life cycle basis, because we'll pay a lot less utilities over the lifetime of the building. And what we'll get out of this is a diversified, sustainable economy where our kids will actually have jobs. And I think it's also possible, because of the nature of these changes, that we may have a more just and equitable society, which would be a really nice side benefit. As Henry David Thoreau said, what use is a house if you haven't got a tolerable planet to put it on? So thank you for taking the time to watch this. I hope you enjoy the rest of the Emerald series, and I thank the Emerald Foundation for making this all possible. Thanks very much.